Now I'd like to welcome to the show Bill Wirtz, a senior policy analyst at the Consumer Choice Center. Welcome to Free the Economy, Bill.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we're here to talk about farm policy. Farm policy. Sometimes it sounds like foreign policy if you say it too fast. And a little bit of both, actually. International farm and agriculture policy, and specifically what our friends in Europe are up to. So for several years, policymakers in the European Union have been working to implement their so-called farm to fork policy, which, among other things, is called for reducing land use and fertilizer and pesticide use. Uh, we can get into all of those details, but can you give us the backstory on this policy? Why did, 4 or 5 years ago, why did the EU decide to move in this direction in the first place?
It lives in the context of the election we had in 2019. In 2019, so we have in the European Union, we have the European elections. So all the member states of the EU vote, all the citizens vote for a European Parliament, and that establishes then a European Commission. And that program was very much based on what was important in 2019. And 2019, if you took a selfie with Greta Thunberg, you could get yourself elected. And that was a very different moment, political moment. This is pre-COVID. This is pre the war in Ukraine. It feels very far away, further than it actually might be. And so, with environmentalists had a monumental political success in that election, and they were really going to set the agenda. And the major political parties were also afraid that all these voters, these young voters that are now voted for environmentalist parties, essentially that was going to be a long-term political shift. And so essentially the European Commission came up with farm to fork by saying, look, a significant, between 10 and 15% of our greenhouse gas emissions stem from agriculture. So we need to do something about this, and we're going to have a major policy to overhaul the complete system of how our farming model is done in Europe. And that's sort of how that came about, and it was presented then in 2020, the year after.
And so, what has the reception been like since then? Because I know I've seen even here in the U.S. I've seen plenty of headlines in recent years of farmers in Europe and various places in Europe, protesting against policies, uh, and, in some cases, dumping truckloads of manure in the middle of cities to get the attention of policymakers and the public. Um, have have there been some things they've liked and some things they haven't liked, or has it just been something that the EU policymakers have put into place and that actual farmers have hated?
So when the policies were initially proposed, it wasn't exactly clear how they were going to be implemented. There's a roadmap. We're going to make farming more sustainable, and then yada yada yada. But it was not very concrete. And then when eventually they made specific benchmarks on how they want to reduce the use, for instance, of crop protection, synthetic crop protection, it became very clear to farmers that this was a bad idea. And so initially it started the way I think it ought to start, in the sense that the farm representatives sent letters and had meetings, bilateral meetings with officials, and said, look, this seems very economically damaging for our business. But the European Commission always said, look, we don't have an impact assessment that tells us that this is a bad idea. And the reason for that is because they didn't publish one. And then USDA actually did. So USDA published an impact assessment looking at farm to fork and if it was implemented, and they looked at a pretty devastating scenario for Europe. It would have meant a loss in GDP between 7 and 12%, which is very significant, and also a reduction in the overall ability to export for European farmers. And if you looked at a global implementation scenario that USDA also calculated, it would have been, I mean, just genuinely problematic to feed the world population. So that came out, and then farmers said, look, we can't do this. It became politically increasingly viable to oppose it. And then when the latest elections that happened in the beginning of this year came around, the farmers said, look, we can now by protesting. And so a lot of them took to the streets to bring attention to this issue. It's like, if you want us to feed you in the future, these policies are just going to sweep the rug from under our feet. And that really gathered the attention. And so then mainstream parties started calling themselves voice of the farmer, farmers' parties, all of these things. So, I mean, this is a very summarized version of what happened because it's really different in each and every European country. So, what the actual demands of farmers were, but it was a gradual realization that we can simply it doesn't scientifically make sense to implement this policy, and we cannot afford it.
Well, yeah, so it seems like there are a couple of uh, different things sort of coming together with a policy like this. One, you have environmentally focused voters in general, but then you have people who are specifically focused on climate change. And so they want reduced greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 and methane and things like that. But then you have sort of older, more traditional environmental concerns, like the idea that there are too many pesticides being used in farm fields. And those strike me as they're sort of conflated often, but they're really two very different things, and they would potentially have different solutions. So I wonder how much because climate change is sort of in my mind sort of swallowed the environmental movement, right? All the more traditional things, sort of everything is about climate now and gets rolled into that. To what extent, or do you think there are two different things going on? And is it possible to talk about those two things or address them separately?
I think this is a very important part of this conversation because the cornerstone proposals in Farm to Fork, the number one actually was the reduction of synthetic pesticides by 50% until 2030. But the policy said that it wants to make agricultural systems ready to deal with climate change and reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, those two things have nothing to do with each other in the sense that the use of synthetic pesticides doesn't actually influence greenhouse gas emissions. It actually does quite the opposite. So, for instance, if you use herbicides, that means you require less tillage, so you don't need as much crop rotation. Now, crop rotation means that you're releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that is stored in the soil. This is actually one of the reasons why American agriculture is more environmentally friendly in that sense, because American farmers use no-till farming significantly more than European farmers. So these two topics already had nothing to do with each other. So essentially, the policy was produced as we're doing something about climate change. This is our dealing with climate change type of policy. But then a lot of things were thrown into that were really the old type of we hate all big business. We don't like that these chemicals producers are poisoning the wells, or all these kind of a bit conspiratorial type of approaches. So that was all sort of conflated, and it didn't really make sense. I mean, if you take another of the proposals, which was to increase organic food production in Europe to 25%. Now we're about 8-9%. And that's what happens when you drop your AirPod. but yeah, so upping that to 25%. Now, I think the listeners ought to know, if you produce organic, I mean, if you prefer organic food for all types of reasons, that's fair, but you cannot claim it's environmentally friendly, especially if you care about climate change, because organic farming needs more resources overall. It needs more land, it needs more water, it needs more energy, it needs more everything. And it's not healthier, or it doesn't taste better. Like, you can do blind taste tests. It's like, it doesn't actually make any difference. Like, the packaging can sway you to think it tastes better, but it doesn't. So a lot of these things were sort of thrown in there. So ultimately, the cause of climate change is the one that people care the most about in that time frame of that legislature. And then a lot of these things were packaged into the legislation by people. Greenpeace is very active, for instance, in the EU. These type of people that were really influential in packaging that policy with the things that they have been asking for since about the 70s. And of course, when it got killed, the roadmap, the entire proposal, a lot of those proposals fell as well. So it was all lumped together. So what they tried to do is, like, we get all of that through in one go. And what happened is, when farmers protested, they wanted to go, of course, get rid of the entire strategy. So all of that fell as well. So I think it's in terms of strategy, I think environmentalists have really gotten sort of the bill for their approach.
Well, and this is actually probably true of both halves of this, both the climate change half and the traditional kind of chemical exposure, environmental concerns. But there, especially when it comes to fertilizers and pesticides, uh, the environmental view seems to be, well, we should just shrink them as much as possible. Right. So maybe we want to shrink them 25% over a certain time span. And then after that, presumably it'll be 50 and 75 and 99 and 99.9% till we get to zero. Uh, but they're sort of treated as if they're sort of pollution, right? But they're closely tied to yields and and the ability to produce. So with there's a reason why modern farmers adopted the use of manufactured fertilizers and pesticides rather than just horse manure from a field, uh, because it allows you to produce more food and produce it more affordably. So the sort of they don't say this out loud, but it's sort of the implication that these are bad, unnatural things that shouldn't be part of the ecosystem and that we need to like run them down to zero seems like um, one, a bad way to approach the issue in general, but it also makes me wonder what whether they're various green parties in Europe or Greenpeace or activist groups, what is their ultimate end game here if they want to wind fertilizer and pesticide use down as much as possible? Are we, uh, is there a few 100 million people out there volunteering not to eat?
Yeah, I always wonder, is it, when you ask the question like what is an opportune thing to pollute for? Ultimately, it's like what can we, it's like I can see how you can convince a large amount of people that a yacht is like not essential. It's like it's polluting, it's bad, and you can sway a large part of the population to ban yachts because it's bad for the environment and there's really no need for it, in sort of an essential way. But food is on a very different level. I mean, you mentioned fertilizer. I mean, you do have an emissions, a problem with fertilizers because of nitrous oxide. Um, and that varies per country. For instance, if you take a country like Ukraine, very fertile soil, and then you compare it to a country like the Netherlands, where you need a lot of fertilizer. It really depends per country also. Um, you do need high yields in order to keep food prices at the level where people can afford it. And for you to not make yourself too dependent on countries that, well, as in Europe, we've recently found out sometimes can be bad trade partners. I mean, Russia used to be a country that we used to import a lot of food from, and now we try not to do that anymore. So in terms of sort of a strategic autonomy, it also feels opportune that we make choices that allows our own producers to be on a level that we can that we can afford to keep doing it. So I feel like ultimately environmentalism is just anti-impact. Anything that will have an impact is ultimately negative. It's not a pro-human approach to, let's overcome these problems that some of which we might have created ourselves, and find solutions to do it better. It's just about anything that has any impact on the environment around us is ultimately morally reprehensible. And I think there's a deep ideological problem there, because when you ask the people who supported this 50% reduction or 25% reduction or whatever, what their utopia is, like what would you actually try and get to? It's like if I could make you king of the world and you can make all these
Right.
decisions unilaterally, you always end up with, no, we should get rid of all of it, of course, ultimately, right? So it's just like sort of this is the stepping stone for where to try to get.
Well, I think it's interesting because when you have a sort of gradual approach, say like in the EU, and they were trying to set benchmarks for like gradually reducing the amount of things like this, agricultural chemicals, fertilizers, pesticides. I think it would be easy to say, oh, don't worry, we'll manage it in a smart way so it won't create dramatic negative impacts. Uh, but then we have real life examples of what happens when when those chemicals go away on a short time span, and that all you have to do is look at Sri Lanka. So the Sri Lankan government, and I think it was the end of 2021, banned the importation of fertilizers, and in 2022 the country had an absolute meltdown, economically, certainly agriculturally, politically. Um, and it was, it was terrible. A country that, produced all its own rice was suddenly importing rice. The its number one export, tea, got hit terribly, and the country was basically falling apart. Um, but it was cheered on by exactly the kind of environmental groups that cheer on the EU policy that is anti-pesticide and fertilizer. And I wonder if the people who say, well, we should only have organic farming, we should get rid of all these synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, have what has then been their response to a situation like Sri Lanka, where the government took their advice and it created uh, a terrible situation.
Of the few responses I've seen, the answer to Sri Lanka has been that it was a bit too quick. So ultimately, he was like, "Oh, if the president sort of rushed this, banning it from, I think it was in a time span of a week. He banned the imports of synthetic pesticides and fertilizers, and that was just too quick. There was not enough of a transition phase, and that's it's unfair to lump all of that together. I mean, the most important transitions to a more sustainable food system ultimately has been technological innovation. I mean, just to give you a reference point, I think Stanford did this study. If we farmed on the world scale the same way we did in the 1960s to produce the same amount of food, we'd need an additional farmland the size of Russia. And for those, like, take out a map of Russia. I think Russia has 11 time zones. It's a massive country. It's the largest
Right.
country in the world. So we don't have the ability to go back to anything like this nostalgia where our ancestors knew and they were more inclined with nature. No, you died of tuberculosis at the age of 35, and you had mold in your food, and most people died of when they ate the food, is like would be liver cancers because of mycotoxin contaminations. It was a terrible time, and we've gotten incredibly sustainable. We make more food with less land since about the beginning of the about the 2000s, but early of the 2000s. So we've come a long way, and these people live in a fantasy world. And Sri Lanka was a phenomenal display of where it can get, because I mean, it's like it went from 10 years in a row, Lonely Planet, #1 country to visit, to absolutely do not visit. And people still today require food aid from India in order to have more than two meals a day. And it's absolutely horrible what happened. And the people, for instance, one of the influencers who's very influential in convincing Sri Lanka to go this way was Vandana Shiva. She's an Indian conspiracy theorist and influencer who travels all around the United States and Europe, speaking at universities, advising governments. She's a personal friend of sorts of King Charles, even, who is also a big believer in organic farming. So these type of people, they never recognize that their experiments go wrong, that they ever been at fault at advising governments wrongly on this. And it's very tragic. It's like, and I'd love to do my just the victory lap of like, I told you so, this was going to go very bad, but it feels also wrong because of the suffering of the people in Sri Lanka who are in a position that I wouldn't wish my worst enemy to have.
Yeah, and nations like the EU, the member nations of the EU are obviously they're richer places than a developing country like Sri Lanka. And so it seems like to some extent that they can sort of paper over the problems caused by these policies with additional sort of subsidies to the food system, right? So if EU policymakers tell EU farmers, you can't do this, you can't do that, you have to change your farming methods, and the farmer's response is, well, that's really going to hurt us. It's possible to say, oh, well, here's some more subsidy operating income. Um, so we're going to make it more difficult for you to farm, but we're going to subsidize it. So we'll just keep doing that into the future. Um, Surely that's going to hit a wall at some point.
Oh yes, and I mean now the European so the European Union budget is about 35%, depends on the years, about 35% of it goes to farm subsidies. That's a lot of money. And these are really in the form of direct payments. It actually became easier now. There's even less conditionality to access those payments. And we've always sort of solved our problems this way in Europe. Each time we had new regulation that made it harder for farmers to do their job, we concluded, well, if you have a problem, we're just going to subsidize you. So for most farmers in Europe, it's baked into the cake. Like without the subsidies, it just doesn't work anymore. It's not a sustainable business whatsoever. And no farmers I talk to are particularly happy about that scenario. And then often, environmentalists will point out, yeah, look how much we subsidize farming and look at the carbon footprint of farming. It's like, it's hard to tell whether ultimately farmers are the benefactors or victims when you compare the regulatory burden against the subsidies. And the only way for us to find out is to lift both. So it's really hard to tell what the real price of food is. But what I can tell you is that this is definitely not a long-term solution, because we're going to get to a point where the tax burden for citizens will just be too high. I mean, for instance, when Vermont wanted to ban, or is in the process of banning, neonicotinoid insecticides. This is very important for farmers to use when you have insect plagues. And then one of the arguments that the lawmakers in Vermont were making that I saw before I testified in the House committee on the Senate Committee on Agriculture was that, look, Quebec has done the same policies right next door. They have the same policies. And I said, yes, but the Quebec government also significantly increased subsidies as a result of that because of lower yields. Now, will you be able to afford that? It's like, will the local taxpayers be able to afford that, to bail out all of these farmers? Is that the long-term solution? Is like the yield is just going to be very low, and then we're going to pay for it through subsidies? It's like on the long term, you can always go, yeah, there's another subsidy we can add to this, but I eventually people are going to catch on to the fact that we also import an increasing amount of food, even though we pay increasingly more for subsidies. Like, it's going to dawn on people that there's something wrong with this.
And so, to me, it's sort of fascinating in the sort of big picture sense that, foreign policies are still so important in European politics and economics, and in Canada and the US. So like you pointed out, since, you know, I think most people think of the Western European, certainly Western European countries, like the countries that are in the G20, like, Spain, France, Italy, formerly the UK, um, as having economies that are driven by things like advanced manufacturing, or maybe luxury consumer goods in the case of France and Spain, or professional services, and that's part of the sort of the evolution of economies that we expect to see from, you start out focusing on agriculture, and then you move to a sort of low level manufacturing, and then you move to sort of high level manufacturing and services as an economy evolves. And I wonder, is does farming have a sort of outsized impact kind of culturally and politically, than, bigger, asymmetric to like the actual percentage of GDP that it produces in Europe? Well, why not? Why doesn't Europe get rid of all of its subsidies and just import all its food?
Oh, I mean, it could do that. Like we would have the ability to do that. It's just politically not viable. In general, if you make policies against farmers, you lose in the long run politically. So and this association is because it's like you have to picture the average European farm is considerably smaller than the average Canadian or American farm. You have olive oil producers that work on on a land area. They work with a land area that would be smaller than some people's like residence where they live. So it's very in touch with the community. It's like you try and buy, like, you can try and buy local for most of the products, unless you live in a big city, in most European countries. So there's a real connection between the farm system and people, and that's what makes it very difficult to make any rules that would contradict the interests of farmers. And the biggest intention this time by environmentalists to do that has really backfired. Um, Ultimately, I mean, what farmer representatives also always say, and what is correct, is like all of us have a background. Like our ancestors were all farmers at one point, unless you're from a very aristocratic family. I guess you would have to go very far into the past to find one that didn't work in that did work in farming. So I think as Europeans we have this connection to it, and then on top of that we have these products that we are known for. Whether it's Italy with Parmesan cheese and olive oil, whether it's French cheeses, or all the all the wine that is produced in Europe. These are things that we show with pride. I think most notably because we don't really have much success in other big industries. This is sort of what's left of Europe. It's like, I mean, look at the tech companies. If it wasn't for Spotify, we wouldn't be represented at all on the world stage when it comes to tech companies. And the cars are increasingly selling less as well. So we really have a problem. And sort of these agricultural products that are of a very high quality and very desired around the world. That's a sense of pride, and anything that would threaten that, we would take personal.
And so, I mentioned the UK, and I think maybe that's an interesting example because the UK was part of the EU for decades, and then after Brexit split off technically, I guess, starting in 2020, and then there was a sort of long negotiating process about how the UK was going to extract itself from EU law and regulation. But uh, because they were part of the EU and then left just in the past few years, then maybe that's an interesting test case to see what does a country who had been part of EU policy for so long do when it comes to farming and agriculture. Has it had the same issues recently? Because one criticism I've heard of Brexit is, you know, well, one is that it was a bad idea and that it was too hard of a break, but the other is that the government in the UK has not taken advantage of its freedom from the EU, and in terms of slashing costly regulations, which was one of the prime reasons why uh, Brexiteers wanted you to vote for Brexit in the first place. So has there been anything interesting to learn from that kind of natural experiment?
So there's a couple of things. It was never going to be easy because of the way that the European Union looks at trade. So increasingly, the EU doesn't look at trade as a mutual recognition of standard type of approach, but it looks at, we obviously, as Europeans, we are so amazing. We have the best food standards and quality standards in the world. All you need to do is adapt to ours, and then you can trade with us. This is increasingly the problem. Um, um, that's why we have conversations about carbon border adjustments, so that anything that is produced with a carbon footprint that wouldn't be up to EU standard can't be imported. So the EU didn't make it easy for the UK to adopt different policies but continue to trade with the EU. So that's one part. An interesting development was that very shortly after the UK exited the European Union, England legalized the genetic engineering in food, which has been a very long taboo. It might get changed in the next few years in the EU, but it's still hanging in the balance. So that was one of the things that could be done immediately, which has incredible benefits, not just from a carbon emissions perspective, but on a resource use perspective, and helping people with specific allergies. You can make gluten-free wheat, you can make nuts that don't cause allergies. There's incredible innovation there. But then the other part is, of course, that the UK isn't that politically different to some of the countries in the EU. And now that the UK has a Labour government, it's going to be one of those things where it's interesting to see what is the Labour government going to do about subsidies and specific regulations, because the Labour Party in the UK also has a very environmentalist approach to a lot of these issues. So there's way too many factors to factor in to see whether there would ultimately have been a benefit. The UK was also very slow in concluding trade deals. There's a lot of time lost there by the Conservative Party. It's complicated. The UK is it's an island, so ultimately it's hard to say anything concrete about where it will go in the future. It does have the opportunity to change policy, but it often doesn't.
Well, I'm also thinking, what is the sort of analogy to the US here? Because in terms of, in maybe a surprising number of ways, the United States as a whole is sort of analogous to the EU as a whole, because I feel like you've got a large geographical area. You got a very large market, but you also have independent states that pass their own regulations, just like the member states of the EU have some of their own regulations. So, like you mentioned, Vermont, is considering its own pesticide ban, and certainly in the United States, California is considered a uh, asymmetrically influential among its fellow states in terms of adopting policy. And a lot of states, especially states that are sort of, center left, blue states, we would say, end up following some of the, environmental policies that originate in uh, California. There's actually a Supreme Court case about uh, California's animal welfare in agriculture law. Um, that was challenged because they said that California was trying to sort of export its rules to the rest of the country and sort of force the rest of, agricultural producers in the rest of the country to follow their lead. And the Supreme Court said, no, actually, it's, California is allowed to put forward that particular livestock treatment law. But so when it comes to all of this, uh, I wonder if there is in the United States an analogy to what the EU has done, and if there's anything policymakers in the United States can learn from what's gone on in the EU, even though we're not necessarily going to be adopting those same policies that have been controversial over there.
Very briefly about California, because I love to bring this up. This I found this quite amazing. In organic agriculture, because there's no real reliable herbicide, you often need to hand weed. So you need to have people on the field to actually, rip out the weeds by hand. Um, Hand weeding has been illegal in California because of the very problematic spinal deformities that you get from long-term hand weeding if you work on those fields. But organic agriculture is exempt from that in California. So the people who buy at Whole Foods buy produce that was produced in a way that only in certain countries in Africa still exists because there's no availability to a lot of these products, the synthetic chemicals and all of these things. So that is always a phenomenal thing. So I think we both have our countries, states that are specifically difficult on these topics, and there's countries that are a lot better. Um, I think so what was interesting to me is that I think it was also 2019, 2020. It was Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and a couple of other senators that had this bill in Congress called PACTPA, protecting Americans from you Americans with your titles for these bills.
Everything has
It's
to be an
fascinating to
acronym.
me. Everything has to be an acronym. Yeah, it was something like that, protecting Americans from toxic chemicals type of thing. And it essentially argued that every piece of agricultural regulation that exists in the EU should be copy pasted for the United States. And I mean, this is the lowest common denominator would have been EU policy. And when you look at the productivity and how much farmers make and how much farmers are subsidized, because farmers are also subsidized in the US, but significantly less than in Europe. Um, it would be absolutely devastating for the United States. And there was so much attention on these farmer protests coming from American media. And I think it's because Americans are a bit perplexed by the idea that farmers could have a significant voice in those policies in the first place. They are an insignificant part of the voting population. And depending on in which state you live, you don't feel connected to farmers whatsoever. So I think the takeaway would be that farm policy is incredibly important because what you think are minor changes to a very complicated system of production and cultivation and seed breeding and all of those elements of farming can have major ramifications. And the price of food is something that hits especially low income households. So Americans are not just significantly wealthier than Europeans if you compare purchasing power. they also pay less for food. There is this image that Europeans have a better diet and eat better, and ultimately the food quality is better because of European regulation. And if only you could adopt the European regulation, everything would be fine and dandy. I think that is misunderstanding the reality. I think ultimately, yes, I will say this. I think we cook better, and we also make better coffee. This is the European in me coming out, but I think that has very little to do with those policies. There are bad incentives given on the production of, for instance, when I look at how corn and corn syrup has been subsidized by the US government, and how that has really funneled a lot of bad decision making on the side of processors.
We
But
do love our high
ultimately,
fructose corn syrup in this country.
yes, it's so there is bad government policy, but the idea is to layer it with even more bad policy from a completely different continent would be the wrong way to go about it. I think the takeaway is, the bottom line is, the failure of Europe to develop its food system into an actual strong export food system that also provides low prices on the local level is a problem of consistent overregulation.
Well, yeah, and I know, if anyone, any of our American, listeners and viewers are wondering how much, all this, EU ag talk has to do with American agriculture policy, and politics and economics. Trust me, if you've been paying attention to American politics over the past 12 months, the price of groceries has been the number one topic everyone is talking about. Inflation, but specifically the prices of groceries. So bad agricultural policy or bad environmental policy that impacts farming, if it raises food costs on American households, that will be absolutely at the top of headlines and at the top of political debates. Bill, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you very much. Before we go, where can people find your work online?
Well, they can go on consumerchoicecenter.org. I work at Consumer Choice Center, so they can find our work there. They can also find me on X, formerly Twitter, at Wirtz, Wirtz Bill. And I also have my website, wirtzbill.com, where I publish all my articles. It's very agriculture heavy. It's
Mhm.
mostly about agriculture these days, agriculture and trade. So they can check me out there, and subscribe, follow, and learn more about sort of what's going wrong in Europe. And what I do a lot is also write for American media about comparing sort of what goes wrong in Europe and why it shouldn't be replicated in the US, because ultimately mostly Americans have already figured it out. It's a more sustainable and more efficient food system. So don't give it up.
All right. Thanks so much for being with us, Bill.
Thank you for having me.